Thank you, John. Just briefly on those controversial unemployment data, the unemployment data that I use are the same data as President Obama and Christy Romer used. The average, according to their data, is 13–14%. Or even actually higher if you want. The average according to the lower data is 13–14%. So you want to be careful with that. The 1936 year is an important year when we think now about government spending and the effect of government spending and then the limit of government spending. We love government spending and we always vote for it. In 1936, the federal government had expanded wildly. It was half again as big as it had been, and it was surpassing for the very first time in peacetime history the size of the states and the towns. That's a very big political gift. Whether it equals strong economic growth and recovery is a second question. John and I do not disagree on the first part of the 1930s, 29, the crash and so on, but a crash, dark time, is not congruent to a Great Depression. We wouldn't remember the Great Depression if it had all gone back to more or less okay in 35. It didn't. We had instead the terrible depression within the depression where people did hang themselves too out of hunger and despair, where unemployment hit 18 or 16%, depending who you want to use. Either way, a horrible number. And that cannot be explained by a market crash, by international forces, even by monetary events. It can't. It can only be explained by government policy. I wonder whether you could have had the CCC and all the wonderful things we do feel nostalgic about that did employ our parents and our grandparents maybe when they had nothing else to do that week, and also not had high taxes and not attack business and not change the rules all the time and not try to run the economy with strange schemes. But I have a sense they go together, that you're going to be dramatic, so you create great social employment programs, and you also do great big things to the economy. A crisis is a terrible thing to waste. You try the experiments you had in your mind already. Finally, I would contend that the US was a good deal less revolutionary than John says, not on the brink of revolution at all, not like Europe. We had Father Coughlin right here. We had Huey Long, but the American labor force was rather quiet overall, especially before the Wagner Act. The scholar Odette Coyne came from Europe and wrote this note, the flabbergasting thing that I have found. American labor is not revolutionary. It's relatively conservative, just as they say today, looking at us, oh wow, labor in the US has a long fuse. The idea of revolution or Roosevelt is a false choice. That's what I would argue. And finally, World War II. Christy Romer, who is in the White House, contends, for example, that it was monetary easing, which is different from fiscal spending, that contributed to the recovery in that period. Last thing to say about World War II that we often fail to mention, when Roosevelt went to war, he forgot about attacking business, because you can't wage war at home and abroad at the same time. And the same people who had been in court were now in the White House writing deals to serve our arming for this great war, or even Lend-Lease before it. So business felt relieved, and you saw that in the economy, and that too helped the recovery.
I agree with Amity that certainty is an important, or greater certainty is an important thing for business, and I think they could have had more consistent policy making during the 1930s, and that would have helped. And I agree that it was not sensible for either Hoover or Roosevelt to raise taxes in the middle of a steep economic downturn. But the question you have to ask if you are rejecting Keynesian spending, and this was a question that a lot of Republicans had to ask themselves within the last year, is what is your alternative? And what was fascinating to me was that certain Republican economists, like Martin Feldstein, who was Ronald Reagan's chairman of his Council of Economic Advisors, they understood that when you're in this situation, there is no alternative to massive government spending. It would be nice if there was. if you could say, all right, well, if we just cut taxes further, we'll take the economy out of a tailspin. You know, we won't have a global meltdown. We won't have these international bank runs, which can now be done with the click of a mouse. It would be nice. It would be nice if there was an alternative, if free market economics and just liquidate, as Hoover's Treasury Secretary, whom Amity admires, that was his policy. It would be nice if that was a recipe for recovery. Unfortunately, it's a recipe for disaster, which there was a total consensus on in 2008, and sensible people in the 1930s recognized that. So I think anybody who wants to critique the New Deal, you know, at its core, rather than at the margins that this policy or that policy could have been better, has to offer a compelling, coherent, and pragmatic alternative to large-scale government spending, which I haven't heard from any of the critics of the New Deal. And by the way, what you spend it on, and there's unanimity across the economics profession on this, is not particularly important. They could be digging holes and filling in the holes, and if you're paying them, you're injecting money into the economy. So yes, there were some make-work projects, boondoggles. It would have been nicer. It was better when it was spent on the good projects, like the CCC projects. But even when there were boondoggles, it was helping to keep people afloat. And I don't think it's a surprise that so many people look back and say, you know, thank God for Franklin Roosevelt, and why long after for his entire life, he was immensely popular with the people, and long after his death, you could go up into a hollow in West Virginia and you'd see a picture of him on the wall.